Good evening, everybody. My name's Chuck Kotnick, and we were discussing who I really am with the library. And
Who are you?
I'm a consultant. And
You said that's the best thing to be because you can claim the things that go right, and the things that go wrong, you can say I didn't do that. Right? Is that right?
Who's introducing who? But I know Greg from a lot of things. I still have images of him coming down the field trying to score a goal on me in the over 40 soccer league.
That's right.
I don't think you ever got one by me, did you?
No, you're too good.
Well, you were fast. I had to become a goalie because these fast guys. But Dr. Greg Kimball is the Director of Public Services and Outreach at the Library of Virginia. I'm still doing that, right?
Yeah, still doing that.
Great.
That's absolutely right.
And he is the author of a book with the title American City, Southern Place, A Cultural History of Antebellum Richmond, and he also is the author of numerous articles and essays. Now, I know Greg mostly from his lecturing and his performances involving American labor, blues, gospel, and country music. And Kathy tells me that we may have Greg back for a program as such. Now, tonight, Dr. Kimball is going to speak about Nottoway Bible. I prepared this special introduction for this. Name, Dr. Kimball. Profession, librarian. Destination, Nottoway County Public Library. Dr. Kimball is bringing with him a Bible taken north at the end of the Civil War. A Bible that, as the spoils of war, do not needed by law to be brought back to Virginia. But laws are made by men, carried out by men, and men are imperfect. So the Bible remained up north, and Dr. Kimball pondered its fate many times as he looked at the world from the window of his car, only to see darkness. But in that darkness, fate moved its huge hand. And to those of you who are my age, I hope you know what I'm referring to here. And anyways, Dr. Richard Kimball.
Richard Kimball! Looking for the one-armed man.
I might find it, and I know Greg will never visit me because I live next to the police chief. But with that,
True. Musicians, right? They're disreputable people usually. So, well, I'm very delighted to be here. My curators are kind of persnickety about bringing manuscripts out of the building, but I will virtually bring you the Bible. And I'm going to go beyond that too, talking not only, we're going to use the example of the Nansemond Bible to talk about a phenomena that I think all of us are probably familiar with. And that is soldiers walking away with the spoils of war. And this happened quite frequently, as Virginia was the largest battleground of the American Civil War. Twice as many battles were fought here as any other southern state. Constant campaigning across the landscape. And just like all soldiers, they picked up souvenirs, whatever you want to call those things. I remember rummaging through my father's desk when I was a child and finding a Nazi ring that he had acquired because he was a guard on trains that took POWs from New York down to camps throughout the South, including in Virginia. And he had a Japanese flag because after that he was sent to the Pacific. And so that's what soldiers do, right? But I'm going to argue that this collecting has more, what's the right word, meaning that we might than simply picking up something loose on the floor of the state capitol after the fall of Richmond. That some of these things that were taken had a lot of meaning for these soldiers in the context of the war that they were engaged in. So we'll talk about things that were taken from county courthouses across Virginia. We will talk about things taken from the state capitol after April 3rd and the great evacuation fire from the Capitol building where the Library of Virginia had its first collections. So, just to give you some idea of why this is so important to us as a library, is that really we don't have a period 3 or 4 months in between when these things come back. We're constantly getting these artifacts back. As particularly northern repositories, whether it's the New England Genealogical Society or a local branch of a record room in New Jersey, are really processing their collections that they haven't looked at in a long time, and all they go, oh, we have this. Why do we have this? So you'll see examples of that as we go along. So let's start with the Nottoway Bible. This is something I'm sure you're very familiar with, this image, the courthouse at Nottoway. And this whole story is told very well by our state librarian. Sure, if you'd like to do that, we'll probably see the images a little bit better. Yeah. This whole story starts, and this was written up very nicely by the state librarian of Virginia, Sandy Treadway, in our magazine Broadside. There was a large meeting going on in Richmond a couple years ago called the National Genealogical Society. 2,600 people came to Virginia to find and talk about their roots. And since Virginia is the oldest North American British colony, we are the most visited state archives in the country. So people loved coming here to do genealogy. And a woman came to that meeting and in a very great act, donated the Nottoway Bible back to the Library of Virginia. In fact, the person who did that, Terry Kutch Bostick, is actually a board member of the National Genealogical Society. And she had acquired this artifact late in the 1970s from an elderly woman named Anna Ruhle, R-U-H-L-E. And in fact, it was her ancestor who had removed the Bible from the courthouse during one of the many campaigns. So, one of the interesting things about Nottoway Courthouse that I'm sure you're all aware of, and is not true, as we'll see with other artifacts, is that built in 1843 with this classic Jeffersonian design. It did not burn during the war. And of course, we have many, many counties that burned either during the war, before, or after. We call those lost record counties, where we have very little documentation of what happened because of these terrible fires. But there was still, these pieces were taken. He was Mr. Ruhle, William Ruhle, who took this piece, was a private in Company D of the New York Heavy Artillery. And it's not really completely clear how he came to acquire it, but his unit was in the area, so we can surmise he took it from the courthouse. He also noted that in his writing about the piece, that he saved it from a fire. Well, we know that's not true. So it's kind of mysterious why he thought this. But at any rate, here is the Bible that came from the courthouse here. One of the interesting things about it is, and here's his inscription, this Bible is a relic of the rebellion of 1861. Why would he call it the War of the Rebellion? It's the northern equivalent, I can say this since I'm from New Hampshire. It's the northern equivalent of saying the War of Northern Aggression. Because the theory is that, of course, secession was illegal. It was a rebellion to be put down, not a legal act by the southern states. So he says, taken from ruins of the chapel of Nottoway Courthouse. We've never been able to figure out why he says this. Virginia, 1864, by William G. Ruhle. Member, Company D, 15th New York Heavy Artillery. So that's the inscription on the Bible. Here's something that's, I think, even more interesting about it. He takes this piece back to New York with him, and he starts recording his own family's history and births and deaths, as people do. We collect, by the way, we have a big Bible record collection at the library. These are essential for genealogy. But here's this northern family, and he's writing in it the family record. So he's kind of like taking over this Bible. This is our state librarian, and this is during the National Geological Society meeting. And she was the person who was presented with the Bible by the board member of the National Geological Society a few years ago. And therefore, it is now part of our collection. Somebody asked me earlier, and it's a good question, well, why didn't it go back to the local court records building? That is really in Virginia a decision that's made individually by the court clerks in concert with us. Some county clerks don't want to have their historical records because they don't have the means to take care of them, and they take up a lot of room. So they often, in some counties, in some cases, we have most of the local records at the library. Now we duplicate those on microfilm back in the day, and we've started to digitize many of them. Some county clerks prefer to keep more of their records locally than at the library. In this case, it seemed logical, because we had records from this period from Nottoway already, to bring it into the library's collection. So let's look at some other examples of this phenomena of soldiers taking pieces from Virginia. Stafford County, a place, again, where are you going to find these artifacts being taken? What's the baseline for that? Got to be where the Union Army was, right? So either the Union Army campaigned through that area, or in some cases, like Tidewater, Virginia, they were in possession of that area for most of the war, and Northern Virginia. Although in those cases, it was pretty stable, so you'd less likely, for instance, have a record taken from, say, Alexandria than you would a campaign area. And that's the case here. This is a book, a Stafford County order book from 1749 to 1755. And you can see, taken from Stafford Courthouse, March 30, 1863. And Captain W.A. Treadwell was a member of the 4th New York Regiment. This volume was handed down several times over many years before it was presented to the Hudson County Historical Society of New York. That collection eventually was transferred to the Jersey City Free Public Library, New Jersey room. And a few years, literally just a year or so ago, someone looking through those records recognized that this just doesn't really belong in our collections. The volume was brought back. It was conserved in the library's in-house conservation lab. It was scanned and microfilmed to ensure its preservation. And those scanned images then can go to the clerk of Stafford to use for research there in the locality. Stafford County is one of many localities that suffered major record losses during the Civil War. And to have this back, a colonial record from a period where we're missing many, many, many records is really, really a wonderful thing. So we very much encourage and are delighted that the folks in New Jersey recognize that this piece needed to be in Virginia. And here's, we actually had a little presentation ceremony. And we sent Carl Charles, who he's not with us anymore, but he was the head of our local records unit, and he went up to New Jersey, and they had a little ceremony where the piece was turned over. Another county that's had a lot of loss is Warwick County. It's one of the first, of course, counties in Virginia, 1634, and it is a lost records locality. Fires have destroyed many of the county's records, and the greatest of those losses was during the Civil War. The clerk's office was burned on December 15, 1864, destroying records from 1787 to 1819. Unfortunately, many Warwick records were brought to Richmond for safekeeping. Guess what happened on April 3rd, 1865? So, didn't really work out. As you see, there's an inscription. It's a little hard to read here. This inscription is essentially what I have up here. This writ was taken from Warwick Courthouse, Warwick County, Virginia, by George H. Sterling. This was a frame that this document was in, a wooden frame. Imagine it wasn't in really good shape because of the migration of the acidity of the wood into the document. This is one of the many things that we have received back from this county. And by the way, we have a database at the library, the Lost Records Localities Digital Collection. So we decided, because there's this problem of people doing research in burned counties, that we would create this digital collection that brings together all the odd pieces from a lot of these lost localities. For instance, we have a huge project where we're digitizing Chancery Court records. Well, often, as happens in legal proceedings, you'll have records from one county that are filed in a suit, say, in another county. We take those and draw them into this collection to strengthen people's ability to work, do historical and genealogical research in those lost counties. I also want to point out we have a great blog called Out of the Box. This is actually the blog that talks about these Warwick County materials that I'm describing. It's a great way for us to get the word out about things that are going on at the library. And particularly, we recently received a collection, which was the subject of this blog post, related to a group of documents that were in Massachusetts. This is a wonderful letter from our collection. You see, 1964. It's from the New England Historic Genealogical Society in Boston. Somebody there has just found a page of a court record from Warwick County, and they're returning it. So this has been happening for a long time. We've been getting these things back over the course of the entire 20th century. This collection came very, very recently to us. This gentleman, Lieutenant Wallace A. Putnam, was the soldier, a second lieutenant in the 10th Massachusetts Regiment during the Peninsular Campaign, and he collected a group of records which ended up in the town archives of Danvers, Massachusetts. And again, one of these situations where the local archivist librarian discovers these materials and realizes, oh my God, these don't belong here. Some of these are incredibly early. A page from a 1663 order book lists the names of numerous individuals fined for not attending church. Yeah, remember the state church, that was the problem. That's kind of what led to Jefferson's Statute for Religious Freedom, is the church and the state pretty much the same thing in colonial Virginia. A fragment of a page torn from a Court of Claims order book from 1691. Records and payments of claims to individuals for recovering the following runaways. An indentured servant named Thomas Leach, who was captured twice, because he was a fairly crafty person. An Irish manservant, and Peter, an Indian servant. Divisions of real and personal property, and lots of other things came back. So this is just amazing stuff to be recovered. Like, this is stuff we would never, we assume has just been lost, and we're not going to be able to recover it. One of the ironies of this particular group of materials is because the Warwick County Courthouse was burned in 1864, if he hadn't stolen these documents, they wouldn't exist. So in this case, this thievery had a positive outcome. I love the language they use. Sometimes they'll say, borrowed from the state library. I don't know what the fine is for 150 years, but. Again, a wonderful piece, local history, Prince William County. So now we're in sort of, the sort of northern tidewater here. order book from 1798, rescued from the flames of the burning building by the 145th Pennsylvania Volunteers, June 1863. These soldiers, if I remember correctly, had already fought in the battles around Spotsylvania, etc., and were on their way to Gettysburg. Now here's one of the biggies. That's the Capitol as it looked right after the fall of Richmond. You can actually see some Union soldiers sort of relaxing around the portico of Jefferson's Capitol. This is one of the pieces that walked away. The Virginia Ordinance of Secession. And we just did actually an exhibit during the sesquicentennial on secession in Virginia, which is a much more complicated process than I think most of us understand. People don't know that twice the Convention of 1861 voted to stay in the Union. It took a lot of arm twisting, and of course, Lincoln calling for 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion didn't help. That was sort of the tipping point. But Virginia was very strongly Unionist for most of the time that the convention was meeting. One of the things that we found out as we researched is that there are actually 3 copies of the Ordinance of Secession. The first is what we call an enrolled bill. It's literally in a book. The convention was sitting essentially as the legislature. And they just recorded stuff that they did in continuous, date. They write the Ordinance of Secession and then something else. So it's not a very impressive looking document. That's actually the legal document, is the enrolled bill. Now there were 2 presentation copies done on vellum, on hide. This being one of them. The other one is in the National Archives. I think they were in Seward's papers. We haven't asked for that one back, but I guess a lot of the Confederate records, of course, are at the National Archives. This one was actually done well after the secession vote, well after Virginia actually mobilizing for war. And one of the interesting things about it is, of the 142 signatures on it, there are people who never voted for secession who said, well, okay, we've seceded now. Yeah, maybe I'll get with the program and put my name on this. There's somebody's name on this document who was dead at the time that this document was put out. He'd been killed in the war. He'd already been killed in action. But he had voted for secession, so somebody decided we better put his name on there. So the history of these documents is actually quite complex. This particular piece was a beautiful piece of calligraphy on the secession document. This particular version, it was done by a Richmond educator and penman. You wanted to have a good person with good calligraphy to do a document like this. His name is William Flegenheimer. He prepared this parchment edition. And they began signing this on June 14th, 1861, again, well after the war started. So Charles W. Bullis, a United States soldier, boy, New York. These New Yorkers seem to take a lot of stuff. He took it home with him. After the fall of Richmond, he found it in the archives. And he said, well, this looks interesting. Sold it to a fellow named Treadwell in 1887, who in turn gave it to his son. And finally it returns to the archives of Virginia in 1929, which, got to give him a little credit. You may know the story that somebody just tried a few years ago to sell the North Carolina's copy of the Bill of Rights, which had been taken also by a Union soldier. There's a great book about it. It's called Lost Rights. And what happened was that same situation, where all these falls, this soldier finds there were presentation copies given to all the original colonies, we have ours, of the Bill of Rights, an official copy. Well, this guy had North Carolina's. Descendants, these 2 sisters who were descendants of the guy who took it, were trying to figure out how to sell it, but of course people like Christie's were like, we're not touching that. Finally, she got this guy, sort of mid-level antique dealer, to try to sell the document. And literally, they're in a hotel room, selling to somebody they think is going to buy the document. They turn out to be FBI agents. So there was a big litigation about, you know, who had right to this document. And there's a principle in American, actually in common law, called replevin, that basically says a government record can never be alienated from the government. No matter what happens to it, it's still a government document and still belongs to the state. And under that principle, North Carolina successfully recovered their copy of the Bill of Rights. And you know, this is you can't even put a value on a document like this. Unbelievable. Well, we were lucky enough in this case to get the Flegenheimer copy of the ordinance back to the state of Virginia in 1929. It wasn't just manuscripts that walked away. Oh, here's our website on Union or Secession. It's a very interesting chapter. Of course, Virginia's seceded much later than the Deep South states. It's a much more complicated process, very interesting process. Even the chaplains got in on the act. This fellow, Chaplain P.G. Cook. This letter is from Roland Lind Hart, a Congregationalist minister and journalist. He's writing to the editor of the Richmond Times-Dispatch and saying, hey, I'm coming south in a few weeks. I have this piece that was taken from Richmond. I would like to bring it back and return it. So books were removed from the state library collection, which again, at the fall of Richmond, was in the Capitol building itself. That's where the state library actually was. The Journal of the Pilgrims at Plymouth was a piece that had originally been in the state library collection. Again, found in Virginia State Library, borrowed, Richmond, April 7th, 1865. Returned May 1911. All right. This, I thought, we have this letter book of Sally Ellen Elsom Crowder Williams. And this is her entry for March 25th, 1865. She's in Nelson County. And looking over the rubbish left me by the Yankees, obviously ransacked her home, I find this little book was spared me, though it made a narrow escape. One of the servants told me a rough, savage-looking man took it up and started off when an officer spied him and called him back to see what kind of book he had. In finding it contained letters from a mother and daughter, he said it should not be destroyed. He then sat down and read it through. So, in this case, a Union officer prevented something from walking away. Here's another one of the iconic documents, and this is where I think we need to sort of think about a little bit about the meaning of taking these documents. It isn't just pillaging. Why would somebody take the Ordinance of Secession, the Union Soul? Why would they particularly want a document like that? What were they fighting for? Union soldiers. What did Lincoln say they were fighting for? The preservation of the Union, right? What document symbolized that treasonous act more than the Ordinance of Secession? So it was a trophy of pretty high order for a Union soldier to spy and decide to take. The same could be said of this, which is the final book of the proceedings of the Journal of the Convention of 1776. There were a series of conventions in Virginia during the Revolution, right before the Revolution, during the crisis with Britain. And finally, in 1776, as we know, the Virginians and the rest of the colonies decided it's over. We're breaking with Britain. We have to fight for our freedom. This is what the clerk put on the very last page. Fini. It's done. This is the last volume of the colonial records of the General Assembly, the oldest continuous democratic body in the Western Hemisphere. that General Assembly, which will be celebrating its 400th anniversary in 1619. No, that's when they were founded. In 2019. A very important date, and something we do need to celebrate. So, think about a Union soldier finding this. This was when the colonies as a group decided, we're Americans. We're not British. We have our own identity. We are going to come together and fight a war against a colonial master, and become our own country. This is what begins us on the road to becoming the United States. Secession represented for a Unionist in the North that, again, the breaking of that bond. So you can imagine a Union soldier looking at this document and how he would, I think, would really understand the meaning of that finis and why it was really important. I don't think all the time it was just random that people took artifacts. I think they understood the meaning of them. And in this case, it was kind of a proclamation of this is what we should have been. We should have been able to stay together and to be a union past this crisis in the 1850s, but we didn't. So, those are just a very small sampling of some of the pieces that had made this crazy journey from Virginia to northern places and then been returned. So let's put up the lights and have some questions.
Greg, why,
Yes?
you know, why was it that they considered it not a rebellion then against England, but it was a rebellion when in the Civil War? I mean, they were both rebellions.
I think there were probably some Southerners that were making that argument. Right? I mean, it all gets down to your definition of what the Constitution meant, your understanding of the rights of states vis-a-vis the federal government, something we certainly have a lot of discussions about today, right? Right? This is still very much an issue we're struggling with. And under certain, you know, if you're under the fire eaters in the South had a view of constitutionalism that differed very dramatically from that of their northern counterparts about whether the Union could be divided, whether a state had the right to secede. And so is it a war of it? The other thing I think Southerners would say is that we are really following the principles of the Revolution. We're preserving what the Revolution built. We're the real patriots. We're the people following Washington and Jefferson and all the icons of revolutionary America, who are, of course, also Virginians. It's the Northerners who've broken that compact. And just like today, these ideologies drive how we think, how we behave, how we use language. So, is it the war between the states? Maybe that's actually the better parallel to the War of the Rebellion for Southerners, the more polite way to say it, right? Because if it's war between the states means what? That each of the states retained a much higher level of authority and rights vis-a-vis the federal government than Northerners were willing to admit.
And this was not the first time, though, that this issue actually was.
Oh, no.
So I guess it was considered a Western president that nullified South Carolina.
Absolutely. You've got Andrew Jackson in the White House, whose famous reply when the Supreme Court said, that made their judgment, and well, how many soldiers do they have? And told South Carolina in no uncertain terms, as Andrew Jackson could do, famously, no, you're staying in the Union. This talk of secession is crazy. There was a convention in New England in the 18-teens that floated the idea of New England breaking off from the rest of the United States. These things do happen. Don't think it couldn't happen again either, because I think it could. Because regional interests in the United States still are very strong. Think about California if they broke off. What are they? I think they're the 8th largest economy in the United States by themselves. I'm sorry, 8th largest in the world. I mean, enormous economy. And it's an interesting thought. 120 to 300 years now. So, now, I'm fairly convinced, I know this is a point of controversy with Civil War II, is that if you actually read the journals of the Secession Convention, and by the way, they're online, they're digital now. We published them in the 60s in these big, like multi-volume, sets. And the people at the University of Richmond decided, hey, it's the sesquicentennial, it's the digital age. They digitized the entire text of the Secession Convention, every word that these guys said in this convention, and they put it on their website. So you can go in there, you can search for terms. You can search for states' rights. You can search for slavery. Guess what? Put in slavery, you get about 700 hits. You put in states' rights, you get about 40. As John Singleton Mosby very famously said in a letter to a friend of his after the war, we're making stuff up here. He had just read a pamphlet that somebody had issued at a dedication of a monument, and he said, come on. We're changing history. We're changing our own history. We know this. We didn't fight for that. We were honest about it at the time. South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, they said why they seceded and won states' rights. Other questions?
Not a historical one. Would you go into some of the archiving techniques that you offer?
Sure. That's a really good question. So, most of what we have in our collection is either brown paper or, and we were talking about this earlier with your director, we are now faced with the problem of digital information. We have an entire website devoted to Tim Kaine's emails. His was the first governorship. When those records came to us, they weren't paper. And we're facing the problem of how do I make that accessible to all of you? The whole idea of an archives is to make information accessible to the people. You own this material, right? Citizens own everything in our building. It's not ours. It's not the state's. It's yours. How are you going to know what your representatives are doing if you can't access it? And so we actually created an entire project, really just as a proof of concept, as it's called these days, to try to figure out how we're going to do this. How are we going to let you go in and see Tim Kaine's reaction in his cabinet to the shooting at Virginia Tech, for instance, which is a very, it's an amazing, actually, story within those archives. And we just ran a blog post about their reaction to Katrina. Bill Leidy, who is his chief of staff, went down there because he had a lot of experience doing things with disaster planning. And Virginia was actually very active and very early in helping Louisiana and New Orleans with that terrible disaster. Now with the older materials, like the Bible, one of the things that we have a problem with is what do you think it makes documents fall apart? You guys probably know this. Depends on what the paper was made out of. Actually, colonial paper and early 19th century paper is basically linen. It's actually very, very durable, and we do have to deacidify it, and that's one of the processes we use. We will actually literally have a liquid bath, and what it does is it draws the acidic content out of the paper, gives it a neutral pH, and stabilizes it. What is probably the worst paper that we have in our collection? Any guesses? Yes, newspapers. Pulp wood newspapers. Terrible, terrible stuff. And it's a real problem because talk about a chronicle, if you want a baseline chronicle of a community, where is it but in the local newspaper, right? And we actually do have a project called the Virginia Newspaper Project that's been going on, which is part of a U.S. newspaper project. I'm going to date myself. I worked on it in Maryland in the early 80s. And at that point, we were just trying to find out what was out there. We were going around squirreling into these places, even into people's houses, like literally documenting who owned what series of different newspapers. I can remember walking through the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore and walking down the aisle of this giant newspaper shelves, and I could hear the crunching under my feet from the little bits of paper that had fallen on the floor. And so that is one of the biggest issues. Now that project moved on to filming, microfilming, which was the technology back then, and now it's moved into digitization. So there is a thing called Chronicling America that Library of Congress has on its site. You'll find a lot of Virginia newspapers on there that we have scanned and contributed to that collection. We at Turner now have a site on our site which mirrors that, has all the Virginia material on it. And that, I will say, newspapers, I'm mostly a 19th century historian, but lately I've gotten into some early 20th century topics, and the power now of being able to search, keyword search in these newspapers is just amazing. I don't know if you saw this story in the newspaper, but there was a 16-year-old girl who had read this article, but it came out 20, 25 years ago, and I remember this article quite well. The article argued that, you know, you've always heard the story, no Irish need apply, that there were these signs in stores, and it was all over the place. And this scholar said, I can't find any evidence of this. This is like an urban myth, basically. You know, he was like, said, that didn't really happen. Well, this 16-year-old girl decided to test that theory. And now, she has many hundreds of thousands of newspaper pages that she can search at the tip of her fingers. In newspaper.com, Chronicling America, and all these archives. Guess what? There's a lot more than a few stories about no Irish need apply than this guy thought. It gives you a sense of how difficult, when I wrote my book, I literally read every day's edition of the Richmond Dispatch from about 1835 to 1861. It took me a long time. I'm sure I missed things because it was just mind-numbing to go through this thing. Well, now I'm not saying everything's digitized. We all wish it was. That's the one thing everyone always asks me, when are you going to digitize this record set or that record set? And I wish we could do all of that. So there's the physical preservation piece. There's preservation through duplicating the material so that the original is handled. Those are probably the two major things.
Greg, we're at a point here in Nottoway County where we have, thanks to some people, a resurrection sort of the Historical Society.
Mm-hmm.
And the library is partnering with them as much as we can. And we have a situation where the historical records that we have been scattered throughout the county, more or less. We have a small history room here in this library. We have a small one in Blackstone. And we have several things at the courthouse. What advice can you give us, you know, as we have decided that this is an important thing for the county to have a local history available for research and whatnot? Where do we start? What do we do?
Yeah, it's all good questions, and I don't work in local records at the library, but I would assume certainly the clerk of the county is going to have very close, you know, connections to people like Greg Crawford, who's our local records person, and be talking actively to him about that material. If you want to create a local repository, one thing you might want to do is, and I don't know the exact situation with the Nottoway records, but I'm assuming, since it's not a Bern County, we have a lot of that material. So who's to say that you couldn't have a project of acquiring, say, the whatever microfilm exists for that county to then be duplicated and put locally here. You could talk to local records about digitization. We've done some pilot projects with other counties and libraries where we have, we had a big project called CW 150. You know, we had this big 150th anniversary thing going on. So the library's like thinking, what do we do? You know, we're more of a repository than anything. So what's our contribution? Well, what we ended up doing was going to every single locality in the state with scanners. We literally just put this stuff in a truck, went to these counties, set up the scanners, set up the computers, and people just brought stuff in. And we got about 10,000 documents, Civil War material no historian's ever touched. Incredible. So we have done some pilots with some other counties where we have brought our team to a place, set up all this equipment, and basically our model was to train the local people to do it, to do the scanning to the standards that you want. Again, with images that are scanned, you can't just, people think you just throw something on a scanner and plop down the top and push the button, but there are standards, certain standards for the image size, file size, type of files, how they're preserved. I don't even want to get into that. What happens if our server crashes? Right? Well, I'll tell you what happens. We have to have surrogate duplication of all of those records. Our servers actually have multiple copies of the same document, so that if one fails, in fact, there are programs that will look at all this, continuously look at the copies, and you can see if one of them has been corrupted and doesn't look like the others. It's pretty amazing. But that's the level at which you have to do to preserve this. If you think it is really a permanent medium, that's the kind of work you have to do. So I think that might be something that the library could help you guys with in terms of bringing some expertise and some equipment to that. I'm sure there's lots of other areas, and I think that's probably, we could have that conversation and talk about what resources we could bring to bear to help you with that.
Yeah, right now, we've got some acid-proof, boxes to start.
And you know what, that's, for a lot of records, particularly things from the 19th century, they're pretty stable, really. It's stuff like digital stuff that scares me a lot more than paper. We know how long paper will last. We really do. I mean, there have been standards for this for years. We're talking many hundreds of years. We don't know how long digital stuff lasts. And of course, the other problem is, even if the file's still there, can you even read it? Right? We've all had that experience, right? Every one of us has had that experience. Oh, I just got my Windows 10 update. Now, oh my God, I can't read this file. What happened? Well, think about that with the volume we're talking about in our servers. A library in Tidewater, I want to say Chesapeake just lost a ton of digital stuff. It's probably the scariest thing right now for us, archivally. I walk in the stacks, I look at the material, and we're constantly doing conservation, don't get me wrong, on the physical material. But I look at it and go, this isn't the problem. Microfilm. Ever smell microfilm that's gone bad? It's terrible. It smells like vinegar. And it does. The older stuff, which was not done to the standards we do today, some of it's degrading. And it's a real problem that we face. We didn't film a lot of this stuff. A lot of it we acquired. Newspapers. We acquired this material from other places. This is what keeps me up at night. It is. It's
your fiddle that keeps you up at night.
Yeah, well, I do have music to keep me sane, but it's a huge challenge, and I don't know that any one institution should be responsible for that. I will say, I wish there was a more comprehensive statewide, but because of the way the code is set up, we don't have that much control over local records, for instance. Now, I get it, that localities, I feel bad for people from Wise County, and we have their records, and they don't have surrogates. That's a problem. I mean, at least you guys can drive like an hour and a half. It's a lot longer for them. I was just on Who Do You Think You Are with Bill Paxton. His relatives in Lee County. The little tip of Virginia that sticks out between Tennessee and Kentucky, which is, I think, closer to 5 other capitals than Richmond. I mean, that's kind of crazy. Hey, we could be Texas or California. That's an even bigger problem. Any other questions? Anything, too. I mean, anything about the library, or doing research there, or anything else?
Where is the Nottoway Bible actually stored in the library?
It is we have we call it the fourth stack. So our building is basically a city block. The first 2 levels are the public areas. Then we have a special collections mezzanine, 2M. And then we have third stack, which is most of the printed material, and then the fourth stack is most of the manuscript material, and that's where it would be. Because we decided, since it came from the courthouse, that it made sense to put it into with the other Nottoway County materials. Now, you could have argued that it's a Bible, it's printed, it should be in special collections, but as long as we can find it, that's the good news. Speaking of that, again, we're talking millions of pieces, I mean literally millions of pieces of paper. I mentioned the Bill of Rights, that every state, original state got a copy. There are 4 that are missing. People are pretty sure that New York Public Library has one of them, but it doesn't have any docketing on it, so we're not sure what state it came from, but it ended up there. I talked to the Georgia State Archivist, and this is what he said. He said, you know, ours is probably somewhere here. But I'm not going to go through and look at every box to find it. Somebody probably will, and you see these articles all the time, where even in a place like New York Public Library or these major national archives, these records are not described down to the item level. They can't be. So someone is going through a box of, you know, who knows what, Civil War records and finds an original Lincoln letter that's never been discovered. It's never been really lost, but kind of it is, because nobody's got the time to look for every single piece of paper in an archive, right? To look for one piece of paper. So they may not be lost. They are lost. Virtually, they are lost. But it may not be that they were sold or taken. They may just simply be in those archives, and nobody knows how to access them. That's kind of the problem we face. And sometimes we'll get these people who write us who did research in our archives like 40 years ago. And they're looking for that one exact thing. Records get reprocessed. Yeah. Sometimes the descriptions get changed. I mean, one set of records that's really interesting, I think, and very apropos of the time we're in right now in terms of the 150th anniversary of Reconstruction. And we found a ton of these in the last 20 years. There are these documents, and these are gold for genealogists, and they're called cohabitation lists. And that's a fancy name for a document where essentially they asked former slaves to come in to the courthouse. And this was a federal, this is the Freedmen's Bureau was doing this, but many of them got left in the counties. And they would record their marriages, because now they could be legally married. And so you have the recording of the mother and father, who their owner was, where it was, who their children were, sometimes even their parents, who their parents were. And so far, I think we're up to 30 odd out of the 100 and something municipalities, counties in Virginia, where only up to about 30, I think we're going to find more. Because usually they were just stuck in the court records in a fairly random fashion. And all of a sudden, we'll run across these. Sometimes the locality will find it. Sometimes it had ended up back at the National Archives as part of the Freedmen's Bureau records. So here's this amazing document that gets, particularly an African-American researcher, back beyond the time of slavery, which is very hard to do. And now they can have 2 more generations of their family that they know where they were, who they were. Fascinating stuff. So even working in a place like ours, you would think that all the discovery is people bringing new stuff to us, but a lot of the discovery is really within our collections. It's just stuff that just appears and go, wow. So, how much fun could you have? This is what a job I have. And I'm in Virginia. It's like, being an archivist in Idaho is probably okay, but we're in Virginia. This is great. And that's the one great thing I always joke about this, because I'm a New Englander, and I'm from New Hampshire, so people in Massachusetts call us Yankees. In Mexico, we're all Yankees north of the border, right? Well, that's kind of the way it is for me. We're real Yankees. But the one thing that we share with Virginia and some other places, I think Texas, is this very strong regional identity. And I get that. It's just like we were talking earlier about how long you had lived here, whether you were a native. My town's exactly the same way. If you came there at a month old, you're not a native. So it's kind of funny, you know, there's sense, a real sense of yourself in a community that I love. I mean, I think it's a really great thing. A lot of people don't have that now, which I think is a really bad thing. Any other questions? Well, you've been a great audience. Thank you very much for having me today.